What made you break the bro code you swore was sacred? My best friend Liam's 8-year-old daughter Sophie came to my apartment at midnight with her backpack and her stuffed rabbit. When I opened the door, she whispered, "Uncle Derek, Daddy's friends are coming tomorrow and I need to hide." Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped the rabbit twice. I picked it up and asked what she meant by hiding. She pulled up her sleeve and showed me cigarette burns in a pattern on her forearm, fresh ones and old scars. "The game room," she said quietly. "Only the special girls get picked for the game room, but if I'm broken, they won't want me." She was burning herself to become unsuitable. I called Liam immediately, my hands shaking. "What the hell is Sophie talking about?" He laughed that easy laugh I'd heard 1,000 times over 15 years of friendship. "Come on, man. You know how dramatic kids are. She probably saw something scary on TV. Bring her back and we'll sort it out." But his voice had this edge to it that made my stomach twist. Something in the way he said dramatic sounded rehearsed, like he'd been expecting this call. I hung up and looked at Sophie, who was staring at my floor. "How many other girls?" I asked. She held up both hands and counted on her fingers. 7, but I'm the oldest. The little ones don't understand the game yet. My phone buzzed with texts from Liam saying I was overreacting and needed to bring Sophie home right now, or he'd call the police for kidnapping. The custody threat, just like that. I called my sister Vanessa, who worked as a social worker. She arrived 20 minutes later in her pajamas and immediately photographed Sophie's arms. The burns were deliberate, spaced evenly, clearly not accidental. Vanessa's face went pale when Sophie described the game room in Liam's basement, how the men would arrive on Friday nights after the mothers dropped off their daughters, how Liam would choose which girl got picked based on who looked prettiest that week. Sophie said she'd been burning herself for 3 weeks trying to make herself ugly enough to avoid selection. Vanessa called her supervisor while I sat with Sophie, who was falling asleep on my couch. My phone kept buzzing with Liam's messages getting angrier. He said I was destroying our friendship over nothing, that Sophie had behavioral issues and made up stories for attention, that his lawyer would have me arrested by morning. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen on that little girl's arm, or the terror in her voice when she talked about tomorrow night. The supervisor arrived at 1 in the morning and took Sophie's statement while recording everything. Sophie described 7 other girls whose mothers had weekend custody arrangements with their fathers. She named each girl and said they all tried different ways to make themselves less attractive. One girl, Mia, had pulled out chunks of her own hair. Another named Zoe wore dirty clothes and refused to bathe. They were 8-year-old children trying to protect themselves from something they didn't have words to describe. The supervisor called the police, and 2 officers showed up an hour later. They took Sophie to the hospital for a medical exam while I gave my statement about how she'd arrived. The officers seemed skeptical at first, treating it like a custody dispute rather than abuse. But when they saw the burns and heard Sophie's consistent story about the game room and the other girls, their attitude shifted. One officer called for a detective, while the other started making notes about the pattern Sophie had described. Detective Rita Alvarez arrived at the hospital at 3 in the morning. She was maybe 45 with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen everything. She interviewed Sophie for an hour while a specialized forensic nurse documented every burn mark. Sophie described the basement game room with its locked door and the camera setup that Liam's friend operated. She said the men would rate the girls and pick one for private time. Rita's face stayed professional, but I saw her hands clench when Sophie described being chosen twice before she started burning herself. Rita asked if Sophie could identify the other girls and their fathers. Sophie nodded and named them, including addresses she'd memorized from visiting their houses during playdates. Rita made calls while I sat in the waiting room, trying to process that my best friend since college was apparently running some kind of systematic abuse ring with other fathers. Liam, who'd been my roommate for 3 years, who'd been the best man at my wedding before my divorce, who I'd trusted with everything. At 6 that morning, Rita came out and said they were executing search warrants on 8 houses simultaneously. She needed me to stay available for more questions, but Sophie would be placed in emergency foster care until they sorted everything out. I asked if I could see her before they took her. Sophie was sitting on a hospital bed holding her rabbit when I walked in. She looked so small and scared. I told her she was brave and did the right thing. She asked if she'd get in trouble for telling secrets. I promised her the only people in trouble were the adults who hurt her. Rita drove me home as the sun came up. She said the coordinated raids would happen at 8, hitting all 8 houses at once so the fathers couldn't warn each other. She'd worked child exploitation cases for 12 years, and this pattern matched organized abuse rings she'd seen before. The basement game room, the rating system, the Friday night schedule. It was too organized to be isolated incidents. She said Liam's phone records showed a group chat with 7 other fathers that would be critical evidence. I sat in my apartment trying to understand how I'd missed this for years. All those Friday nights when Liam said he was having the guys over to watch fights, how he'd been weird about anyone coming over on weekends when Sophie visited, the time I'd stopped by unannounced and he'd been angry instead of welcoming like usual. Signs I'd ignored because he was my best friend and I trusted him completely. My phone rang at 8:30. Vanessa said the raids had gone smoothly and they'd found camera equipment in all 8 basements. The fathers had been arrested and the mothers were being interviewed about what they knew. Sophie's mother, Natalie, was at the police station crying, saying she'd had no idea anything was wrong. She'd noticed Sophie's burns, but believed Liam's explanation that Sophie was self-harming due to the divorce stress. Rita called at noon, asking me to come to the station for a formal statement. I spent 3 hours describing my 15-year friendship with Liam, trying to identify anything I'd seen that should have raised red flags. I mentioned the Friday night poker games that I'd never been invited to after Sophie started visiting, how Liam had gotten defensive when I'd asked to meet his poker buddies, how he'd installed those new locks on his basement door and said it was for security. Rita took notes on everything, and I felt sick realizing I'd accepted his explanations without question. The other fathers were being interviewed in separate rooms, and Rita said 2 had already started talking, trying to minimize their involvement. One claimed he'd only watched and never touched anyone. Another said Liam had pressured him into participating, and he'd felt trapped. Rita's expression made it clear she wasn't buying their excuses. The news broke that evening. 8 fathers arrested in coordinated raids on child exploitation ring. My phone exploded with messages from mutual friends asking if I knew about Liam's arrest. Some people were supportive, but others accused me of overreacting and destroying a good man's life over false allegations. One guy from our college friend group sent me a long message about false accusations and how I should have talked to Liam privately instead of involving police. I blocked him immediately. Vanessa called to warn me that some of the fathers' families were hiring expensive lawyers and planning to paint this as a conspiracy by vindictive ex-wives coaching children. Patricia Winters, one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in the state, was already representing 2 of the fathers. She'd given a press conference claiming the children had been manipulated by their mothers, and the real abuse was the false accusations destroying these men's reputations. But Rita had the evidence from the basements, including the camera footage. Over the next week, forensic teams processed all 8 houses. They found hundreds of videos on encrypted hard drives, documenting years of abuse. The videos showed the rating system Sophie had described, with the fathers scoring girls based on appearance before selecting one for the game room. Some videos were 2 years old, meaning this had been happening long before Sophie started burning herself. The youngest victim was 5 years old. Rita called me with updates, and each one made me feel worse about missing the signs. The preliminary evidence showed Liam had started this whole system 3 years ago after connecting with like-minded fathers in an online forum. He'd recruited them carefully, establishing trust before revealing the real purpose of their Friday night gatherings. They'd created elaborate rules about selecting victims and maintaining secrecy. The group chat showed them joking about which girl would be chosen next and sharing strategies for keeping the mothers unaware. Natalie came to see me on Monday. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in a week. She sat in my living room and cried, asking how she could have missed this. Sophie had been visiting Liam every other weekend for 2 years. Natalie had never seen anything wrong beyond the normal adjustment issues of a child dealing with divorced parents. She'd noticed Sophie becoming anxious before visits, but thought it was separation anxiety from her. The burns had started 3 weeks ago, and Sophie had said she'd been experimenting with a lighter she found. Natalie had believed her because why would she lie about something like that? I told Natalie this wasn't her fault, but she just shook her head and kept crying. She said Sophie's therapist had expressed concerns about her anxiety levels 6 months ago, but Liam had convinced Natalie the therapist was overreacting and just wanted to bill more sessions. Natalie had switched therapists instead of investigating further. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Rita said I'd need to testify about how Sophie had come to me and what I'd seen. The defense lawyers were already trying to suppress evidence and discredit Sophie's testimony. Patricia Winters filed motions claiming the search warrants were based on a hysterical child's fantasy and all evidence should be thrown out. She argued that Sophie had a history of attention-seeking behavior, citing school records where teachers had noted her dramatic storytelling during creative writing. The prosecutor, District Attorney Marcus Shaw, filed responses showing the search warrants were properly obtained based on physical evidence of the burns and Sophie's detailed, consistent statements. He attached the forensic medical report documenting burn patterns inconsistent with self-inflicted injury. An expert would testify the burns required another person to hold her arm steady while inflicting them. This contradicted Sophie's initial story about experimenting with a lighter, which she'd only said because Liam had coached her to lie. I spent those 3 weeks trying to process that my best friend was a monster. We'd known each other since freshman year of college. We'd lived together, traveled together, been in each other's weddings. He'd helped me move after my divorce. I'd loaned him money when his business was struggling. How do you reconcile 15 years of friendship with the reality that he was systematically abusing children, including his own daughter? Some of our mutual friends stopped talking to me. They believed Liam's lawyer's narrative that vindictive ex-wives had coached children to make false accusations. One guy told me I'd betrayed the bro code by calling police instead of talking to Liam privately first. He said real friends handle things internally and don't get authorities involved. I told him the bro code doesn't cover child abuse and blocked his number, but it hurt losing friends who'd rather protect an abuser than believe victims. The preliminary hearing was brutal. I sat in the gallery watching 8 defense attorneys attack Sophie's credibility. Patricia Winters was the worst, suggesting Sophie had behavioral problems and was angry about her parents' divorce. She pointed out that Sophie's school records showed her getting in trouble for lying last year when she'd claimed her homework was eaten by her dog. Patricia argued that Sophie was an established liar seeking attention by making dramatic accusations. But then the prosecutor played one of the videos found in Liam's basement. The courtroom went silent. You could hear Sophie crying off camera while Liam's voice directed someone else to start recording. The judge called a recess, and 3 of the defense attorneys huddled with their clients. By the time court resumed, 2 fathers had fired Patricia Winters and were negotiating plea deals. They'd realized a jury would see those videos and convict them immediately. Liam refused to take a deal. His new attorney, Gregory Stone, argued the videos showed poor judgment but not criminal abuse. Stone claimed the fathers had been documenting concerning behavior by their daughters, who were self-harming and needed intervention. He said the rating system was actually a mental health assessment tool they'd developed. The judge looked disgusted, but had to let Stone make his arguments for the record. The trial was set for 4 months later. In the meantime, all 8 girls were placed in therapeutic foster care with trauma specialists. Sophie was living with a woman named Dorothy, who had 30 years of experience with abuse victims. Vanessa arranged for me to visit Sophie once a month under supervision. The first visit was awkward. Sophie seemed smaller somehow, quieter. She'd stopped burning herself, but had started pulling out her eyelashes when she got anxious. Dorothy said it was a common response to trauma, giving victims a sense of control over their bodies when everything else felt chaotic. Sophie showed me drawings she'd made in therapy. Dark pictures with stick figures in basements and cameras and men with angry faces, but also some hopeful ones with rainbows and houses, and a girl holding a rabbit. Dorothy said the mix of dark and light was healthy, showing Sophie could still imagine a better future, despite what she'd been through. 2 of the mothers came forward with information they'd been too scared to share initially. Liam had been blackmailing them with photos he'd taken during custody exchanges, threatening to claim they were unfit mothers if they asked too many questions. One mother, Rebecca, said she'd noticed bruising on her daughter Mia 6 months ago. When she'd asked Liam about it, he'd shown her a photo of Rebecca's car parked outside a bar at midnight. He'd said a judge would love to hear about her drinking problem and maybe she should focus on her own issues instead of making false accusations. Rebecca had backed off, terrified of losing custody. Another mother, Grace, had tried reporting concerns to CPS 10 months ago. The caseworker had investigated and closed the case as unfounded after Liam provided school records showing the girls had behavioral issues and were making up stories for attention. He'd been one step ahead, creating documentation that made the mothers look hysterical and the girls look unreliable. The system had failed these children because Liam had learned how to manipulate it. Rita was building a conspiracy case showing how Liam had orchestrated everything. He'd created the online forum that connected the fathers. He'd designed the rating system and selection process. He'd provided the camera equipment and taught the others how to encrypt their videos. The group chat showed Liam as the ringleader, with the others following his guidance. My testimony was scheduled for the second day of trial. I spent the night before reviewing my statement with the prosecutor. He warned me Stone would try to paint me as a disloyal friend seeking attention or trying to eliminate Liam from Sophie's life so I could replace him as her father figure. I needed to stay calm and stick to facts no matter what Stone accused me of. The courtroom was packed when I took the stand. I saw Natalie in the front row with the other mothers. Sophie wasn't there because she'd testified earlier via closed-circuit video to avoid facing Liam directly. I described that midnight knock on my door and Sophie's terrified face when she'd shown me the burns. I explained calling Liam and his defensive reaction, how his voice had sounded wrong, too casual, too dismissive. Stone's cross-examination was aggressive. He asked about my divorce and whether I was jealous of Liam's seemingly stable family life. He suggested I'd been looking for a way to hurt Liam because he'd remained close with my ex-wife. He brought up text messages where I'd complained about being lonely and implied I had inappropriate interest in becoming Sophie's primary male role model. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, but Stone had planted seeds of doubt. He asked if I had any evidence beyond a traumatized child's story. I pointed out the burns weren't a story, they were physical evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard from forensic experts who analyzed the videos and testified about the systematic nature of the abuse. They heard from therapists who'd worked with the girls and documented consistent trauma responses. They heard from the mothers who'd been manipulated and blackmailed into silence. They heard from 2 of the fathers who'd taken plea deals and testified about how Liam had recruited and organized them. And they saw the videos, which were the most damning evidence of all. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding all 6 remaining defendants guilty on all charges. Liam was convicted of conspiracy, child abuse, child exploitation, and unlawful imprisonment. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, and Liam was remanded into custody immediately. As they led him out in handcuffs, he looked right at me with pure hatred, like I was the villain in this story instead of the children he'd hurt. Sentencing day brought all the mothers and their daughters to court. Sophie was there with Dorothy, looking nervous. The judge heard victim impact statements from 5 of the mothers, describing how the abuse had destroyed their daughters' childhoods and shattered their trust. Rebecca talked about Mia's nightmares and refusal to be alone with any adult men. Grace described how her daughter Zoe had stopped eating and was hospitalized for malnutrition. When it was time for the judge to speak, She spent 15 minutes detailing the systematic nature of Liam's crimes. She noted that he'd created and led the conspiracy, recruited other fathers, and shown no remorse throughout the trial. His attempts to blame the victims and their mothers demonstrated a fundamental lack of empathy or accountability. She sentenced Liam to 35 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. The other fathers received sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt this weird mix of relief and grief. Relief that Sophie and the other girls would be safe. Grief for the friendship I'd thought I had but realized was built on lies. Vanessa met me outside and gave me a hug. She said she was proud of me for choosing Sophie over a friendship that wasn't worth keeping. Sophie's progress over the next year was remarkable. She continued living with Dorothy while attending trauma therapy twice a week. The self-harm behaviors gradually decreased as she learned healthier coping strategies. Her eyelashes grew back, and she stopped checking constantly to see if she looked pretty enough to be in danger. I kept visiting Sophie once a month under Dorothy's supervision. We'd play board games or bake cookies or sometimes just talk about nothing important. She started calling me Uncle Derek again, instead of the formal Derek she'd used for months after everything happened. Natalie worked hard to rebuild her relationship with Sophie, attending family therapy sessions to address the guilt she carried about missing the warning signs. The therapist helped them both understand that Liam had been sophisticated in his manipulation of everyone around him. Sophie eventually moved back with Natalie after a year in foster care, with continued therapy and regular check-ins from CPS. The transition was gradual, starting with day visits, then overnight visits, then weekends, until Sophie felt safe enough for full-time placement. Dorothy remained a supportive presence in their lives. The other families went through similar healing processes, with varying degrees of success. Some mothers and daughters rebuilt their relationships. Others struggled with resentment and blame that therapy couldn't fully resolve. 2 of the mothers formed a support group that met monthly, sharing resources and coping strategies. Rebecca started a nonprofit focused on educating parents about recognizing and reporting suspected child abuse. She gave presentations at schools and community centers, teaching people to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. Grace volunteered with the nonprofit, sharing her story about how she'd reported concerns to CPS and been dismissed. They worked with legislators to strengthen reporting and investigation protocols. I became involved with the nonprofit too, speaking about the friend perspective and how loyalty can blind us to abuse happening right in front of us. It was uncomfortable sharing how I'd missed so many signs and dismissed my own instincts when things felt off about Liam's behavior. But people needed to hear that predators don't look like monsters. They look like your best friend, your brother, your coach, your neighbor. They're charming and helpful and seem trustworthy because that's how they gain access to victims. The hardest part was explaining the bro code and how it had almost stopped me from helping Sophie. That toxic idea that men protect each other no matter what, that you don't question your friends or involve outside authorities in their business. I'd been raised on those unspoken rules about loyalty and not being a snitch. But that code has nothing to do with honor or friendship. Real loyalty means holding friends accountable and protecting people who can't protect themselves. During one speaking engagement, a teenage boy asked me if I regretted losing my best friend. I told him the truth. I regretted that Liam had been living a lie our entire friendship. But I didn't regret calling the police that night, or testifying at trial, or any decision that prioritized Sophie's safety over my comfort. 3 years after Liam's conviction, Sophie was 11 and thriving. She played soccer and took art classes and had normal kid friendships. She still saw her therapist monthly for maintenance, but the crisis had passed. She'd written a letter during one session that said, "Thank you for believing a scared 8-year-old girl at midnight and choosing her safety over friendship." She said that decision had saved her life and given her the chance to become who she was today. Reading that letter still makes me emotional, because I came so close to making the wrong choice that night. When Sophie had first knocked, half asleep and confused, I'd almost believed Liam's explanation that she was being dramatic. The only thing that stopped me was actually seeing those burns and the terror in her eyes. I got to visit Sophie at Natalie's house now without supervision. We'd have dinner together, and Sophie would tell me about school and her friends and the art project she was working on. Normal stuff. Safe stuff. Natalie and I had become genuine friends through this nightmare, bonded by our determination to help Sophie heal. Sometimes I'd see Natalie looking at Sophie with this mixture of love and lingering guilt, even though her therapist had helped her work through the self-blame. We'd all carry scars from this, though in ways infinitely smaller than what Sophie and the other girls had endured. 5 years after that midnight knock, Sophie asked me why I'd helped her when her daddy was my best friend. We were sitting in Natalie's backyard when she brought it up. She said kids at school had friends who did bad things, and they protected each other. Why hadn't I protected her dad? I thought carefully about how to answer. I told her that real friendship means helping people be better, not helping them hurt others. That being loyal doesn't mean covering up crimes or staying silent when someone is in danger. That she was a child who needed help, and no friendship is more important than a child's safety. She nodded slowly and asked if I was sad about losing my friend. I admitted that I was sad about losing who I thought Liam was, but the person I'd been friends with was partially an illusion. So maybe I hadn't lost a friend so much as discovered I'd never fully known him. That conversation stayed with me because it highlighted the complexity of these situations. I wasn't heroic for helping Sophie. I just did what any decent person should do when a child asks for help. And I wasn't completely innocent either because I'd missed signs and chosen to believe Liam's lies when questioning would have been uncomfortable. We're all capable of looking away when the truth is inconvenient. The nonprofit work continued growing. Rebecca expanded the organization to offer prevention programs in schools and support groups for families affected by child abuse. Grace developed a training program for CPS workers on recognizing manipulation tactics that abusers use to discredit reports. I contributed by speaking at men's groups and sports teams about toxic masculinity and the bro code, challenging the idea that loyalty means protecting friends who harm others. Several men reached out afterward to thank me for giving them language and permission to act on their concerns instead of looking away. One guy reported his brother-in-law for suspected abuse after attending my presentation. Another confronted his friend group about their jokes that normalized violence. These small acts of courage accumulated into cultural change. On Sophie's 14th birthday, Natalie threw a party with Sophie's friends from school. I brought a professional art set since Sophie was getting serious about drawing. She opened it, and her face lit up with genuine happiness. Later, while the other kids were eating cake, Sophie came over and hugged me. She said I was one of her favorite people, and she was glad I'd been brave enough to help her even though it was hard. That hug made every difficult moment worth it. All the lost friendships, the hostile messages, the painful testimony, the complicated grief about Liam. Worth it, because Sophie was safe and thriving and building a life free from the horror Liam had created. When people asked about my former best friend, I told the truth without dramatizing or minimizing what he'd done. Liam was serving 35 years for organizing and leading a child abuse ring. The friendship I'd thought we had was built on lies. I missed who I'd believed him to be, but that person had never fully existed, and I'd break the bro code again in a heartbeat if it meant protecting a child. By the time Sophie turned 16, she'd become an impressive young woman who'd transformed her trauma into purpose. She spoke at school assemblies about recognizing abuse and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. She volunteered with the nonprofit, mentoring younger abuse survivors. She maintained good grades and had been accepted into a summer art program at a prestigious university. None of this erased what she'd been through, but it showed that trauma didn't have to define someone's entire life. I attended one of her speaking events at a high school and watched her tell her story with strength and clarity. She described the game room and the burns and the fear without falling apart. She explained how telling had saved her and 6 other girls. She talked about the importance of adults who believe children and act on that belief. When she finished, the students gave her a standing ovation. Afterward, a girl approached Sophie and asked to talk privately. Dorothy and I waited while they spoke. When Sophie came back, she said the girl had described something happening at home that sounded like abuse. Sophie had given her the Advocacy Center's phone number. Sophie prepared for college with plans to major in psychology with a focus on trauma recovery. She wanted to help other survivors heal and work on prevention programs. Natalie was proud and terrified, worried about sending her daughter into the world after everything they'd been through. But Sophie was ready, healthy enough to function independently while maintaining her therapy and support systems. The night before Sophie left for college, she came to my apartment for dinner. We talked about her classes and her roommate and campus safety. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she'd forgiven her dad, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting. Forgiveness didn't mean what he did was okay, or that she'd ever have a relationship with him. It meant she was releasing the hold his actions had on her emotional well-being. I told her that was incredibly mature and brave. She'd found a way to acknowledge what happened while not letting it consume her entire identity. She was Sophie, the artist and advocate and psychology student, who'd also survived abuse and come out stronger. The trauma was part of her story, but not the whole story. That was the ultimate victory over Liam and what he'd tried to do to her. In my work with the nonprofit, I kept encountering men who struggled with similar situations. They'd discovered a friend or family member was abusing someone and felt torn between loyalty and doing the right thing. I'd tell them about Sophie knocking on my door and the choice I'd faced that night. How I'd almost believed Liam's dismissive explanation. How close I'd come to sending Sophie back into danger because confronting the truth was uncomfortable. These conversations seemed to help men understand that the bro code was designed to protect abusers. That real strength meant standing up for vulnerable people even when it cost you friendships. Several men reached out afterward saying my story had given them permission to act on their concerns. One guy reported his brother for suspected abuse. Another confronted his friend about concerning behavior around children. These small acts of courage accumulated into cultural change, slowly eroding the idea that men should protect each other regardless of their actions. Looking back across those years, I saw how that single moment had transformed everything. How saying yes to a scared child had led to 8 convictions, systematic changes in investigation protocols, a national nonprofit, and hundreds of children being saved from ongoing abuse. None of it had felt heroic at the time. I'd just been a guy who couldn't ignore burns on a child's arm and terror in her voice. But that's usually how real courage works. Not grand dramatic gestures, but small choices to care more about someone's safety than your own comfort. Sophie eventually asked if I'd walk her down the aisle at her wedding, since her biological father was obviously not an option. I said yes immediately, honored that she'd want me in that role. The wedding was beautiful. Natalie cried through the entire ceremony. Dorothy sat in the front row, beaming. Sophie's colleagues from the nonprofit attended, along with some of the other survivors from that original group of girls. They'd all built lives despite their trauma. During her vows, Sophie talked about how love meant choosing someone's well-being over your own comfort. She looked at me when she said it, and I understood she was also talking about that midnight knock years ago. At the reception, I gave a speech about Sophie's resilience and the incredible work she'd done transforming trauma into purpose. I talked about how proud I was to have played a small role in her journey. Then I raised my glass and said, "Here's to choosing courage, breaking toxic codes, and believing children." Later, as I watched Sophie dance with her spouse, Natalie came over and stood next to me. She said, "Thank you for believing Sophie that night. Thank you for calling the police instead of trying to handle it quietly. Thank you for everything." I told her we'd all done it together, that Sophie's healing had been a team effort. But Natalie said it started with me opening that door at midnight and choosing Sophie over Liam. Everything else had flowed from that first moment of believing her. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.